All right, let's get going. Thank you so much for everybody who has been introducing themselves in the group chat. Welcome. This is our evening with the authors. I'm your host for this evening. My name is Claire Rivero, and I'm the Digital Strategy Manager here at Student Achievement Partner. And then our main guests tonight, the authors, are Meredith and David Liben, and they are the authors of a newly published book, Know Better, Do Better, Teaching the Foundations So Every Child Can Read. And you'll be able to learn more about their book tonight. They're going to give you a little overview, and then they'll dive right into answering a lot of the questions that you all have about teaching reading. And thank you so much to everyone who has already submitted questions for them. We'll be answering as many of those as we can. And then you can also feel free to ask questions tonight via the Q&A widget. And you can ask those at any time, and we'll get to as many of those as we can as well. So this is part of our Core Advocate webinar series. Everyone is welcome tonight. You do not have to be a Core Advocate. But if you are interested in joining the Core Advocate Network, there's some information on this slide, and you will get access to all of the slides. They're in your resource widget right now. But this slide has some information about joining our Core Advocate Network. If you have questions, you can reach out to Jenny Beltramini. Her email address is here. And then if you're ready to join the network, it's a free network. You can register by following this link. This link is also in your resource widget. And we're about to launch our inaugural edition of our Core Advocate e-magazine. It's a digital magazine. We're really excited about it. So if you register in the next 2 days, we're going to send it in just a few days. So if you register in the next 2 days, you'll be able to get that new magazine as well, which is just full of great information and goodies. And then lastly, a lot of the resources that we'll be talking about tonight are featured on our website, achievethecore.org. So if you haven't been there yet, please go check that out. So tonight, we really want this, as I said, to be about a discussion. So if you are active on Twitter and use that in your professional capacity, we invite you to share what you're learning with your digital Twitter professional learning network by using #CoreAdvocates. You can also reach out directly to us. We are at AchieveTheCore on Twitter, and Meredith and David are also on Twitter. Their handles are there if you want to reach out directly to them on Twitter. So tonight we want you to engage with us. So the main portion of this will be a Q&A session. So if you have a question for Meredith and David, you can use that purple Q&A button at any time during the webinar to submit a question for Meredith and David, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. And then you can use the group chat, which many of you are already doing, to comment, have discussion while the webinar is happening with the other participants. And as I mentioned, the resources widget, which is that green widget, is full of lots of great links and resources. The slides are there, the link to Meredith and David's book is there, and links to all of the free resources which Meredith and David will be mentioning tonight, they'll all be there. So after the discussion is complete, we will send all of you who are on tonight a recorded version of the discussion, and then in 2 weeks, be on the lookout, we'll be sending an email with a survey. And that survey really has to do with just asking you whether you've had a chance to share or use anything that you learned tonight, because that's really of interest to us, whether the content of these webinars is useful to you. And then if you complete that survey, that will automatically generate a completion certificate, which has 1 professional learning credit hour, which you can use for your certification. So now I'm going to pass it over to David and Meredith to introduce their book.
Our book was really fun to write and really hard to write. And a little bit of evidence to how people who've been involved in education for many decades can still screw up. We did not give ourselves nearly the time, and we had to really knock ourselves out to get it done by the time the publisher wanted. That being the case, we've only gotten good feedback from anybody who's read it. It's actually doing quite well on Amazon. It takes a little thinking to figure out Amazon's algorithms for how they rate books, considering they have multiple millions. Last I checked, ours was actually like 17,000. Well, that's not too bad out of multiple millions. The origin of the book came from actually a Core Advocate convening, where I gave a talk on foundational skills with some other people from SAP. And there was someone there from Learning Sciences International which is the organization that works with Robert Marzano. And she came up and said, you guys have got to write a book. She had already met and fallen in love with Meredith. She said, you guys have got to write a book on foundational skills. And that was the origin of the book. And I would say we're pretty happy with how it came out. I would also say that in the process, we've learned a great deal, not just about writing a book, but about wading into all the obstacles when you're talking about everything for foundational skills K-2. And not only that, but for unfinished learning, which continues to get more attention than any other part of the book.
And judging from the eclectic group on the call tonight, is a concern of many of yours. And so we'll touch on that. Some of the pre-submitted questions were about that, and some of the questions coming in as well. And chapter 7 specifically in the book, which is the final chapter, talks about what to do with students who are older and have unfinished literacy learning. It isn't comprehensive, it's just one chapter. And we're hoping to actually work that up into its own course, a sort of virtual PLC at some point this school year, through the same, probably this very same medium, where it would be sort of an action research group where we'd present a chunk of the chapter, talk about an action step, and then all the participants would go try that thing out with a student or students or relative, whoever, but a live person, a live student. The book also is structured, we wanted it to be accessible to everybody, to parents who were concerned about their children's reading or wanted to be advocates for their children learning to read, but mostly we wanted it to be clear and available for teachers. And so it's highly narrative. We have lots of our own stories. A fair proportion of them are stories of learning through our own failures and what we did when we felt we'd failed kids, which all educators do a lot. So we talk a lot about our own learning, especially early on, our learning and the mistakes we made and how we came to become students of the science of reading. So every single chapter starts with a story, and often that narrative thread's picked up later in the chapter. And we definitely present research, but we try to do it in a lightweight way, and we point at resources as much as we can as well.
Do you still want to give a summary of chapter 7? Yes.
A specific summary? Why don't you do that?
Okay.
Yeah.
Chapter 7 for unfinished learners. You can have two kinds of research in this regard. You can have a specific method or series of methods or program and look at pre and post test results or treat or compare to other groups. Has this method or this series of approaches produced significant decreases in students in the gap between grade level and where students are? And then you can have research to look at, is it replicable? So you came up with a method to significantly decrease how far behind students are, and was it then adopted in a wide number of districts or schools? There's absolutely nothing that has ever been found that was replicated. Not one single method has been replicated in any significant way to significantly reduce the achievement gap in kids who are significantly behind in reading. Is there specific methods or approaches that maybe were not replicated? Very few there as well. And so I asked myself in writing this chapter, the first draft of this chapter, why is that? And the reason is that kids who are far behind are often far behind in their decoding and certainly far behind in their fluency. Some may decode with accuracy and even automaticity, and some may not even do that. And some may, if they decode with accuracy and automaticity, they just may need work on fluency. And that is often addressed in any kind of program, whether it's large scale or not, with students who are significantly far behind. But if they've been far behind for any number of years, they're also far behind on vocabulary and far behind on background knowledge. They have less familiarity, if any, with complex text, including syntax, coherence, and anything else. So if you're going to address it, you have to address all of it. And there's no program that does that. And that's probably the reason why we've had so little result. The other thing you have to do is you have to address how kids feel about themselves. If kids been behind for years, they inevitably do not feel good about themselves as readers or as students. So you have to address that. And you have to do it in a meaningful way, meaning you have to, as much as possible, use materials that are meaningful to students and text that is part of their Tier 1 instruction. When you use text that are part of their Tier 1 instruction, then it's, in a way, it's like giving them a preview or giving them additional support. If they have to read a complex grade level text in the 5th grade having to do with the biography of Richard Feynman, the physicist, and you're working with kids who are 3 years behind grade level to support them on that before they go to the class when everyone else reads it, well, then that's not remedial, that's pre-medial. And that gives those kids extra support and extra confidence. So you have to deal with the social and emotional learning. You have to deal with the lack of background knowledge and the lack of vocabulary and the lack of experience with complex text. And you have to do all of that, as well as the foundational skills, including decoding if it's necessary, and certainly, as it almost always is, fluency. And Chapter 7 is an attempt to show how to do that in any kind of Tier 2 setting. It's not a curriculum in and of itself, but it's meant for teachers in elementary school or middle school who, either in their own classrooms or as a Tier 2 pull-out teacher or a Tier 2 teacher of any sort, here's what you can do that over a period of time can work with these kinds of students. And in the teachers who've grabbed it already early, the early adopters, quote unquote, last spring, it was overwhelmingly clear what they said. Number one, meeting the emotional needs of the students, talking about why they were behind and what it meant and what you can do about it, and using materials from their Tier 1 instruction changed everything in the way that those teachers had over the past years worked in a Tier 2 intervention setting. So I can't summarize that. That is a summary of Chapter 7. It addresses all of these issues through complex grade level texts and other texts, and how you can do it with text from students' Tier 1 instructions. But I can't replicate all of the details in that chapter, because it's, I believe, the longest chapter and in many ways the most dense chapter in the book, because I'm really freaking old. I've been doing this work for 35, 40 years, and 25 years certainly as a consultant. And there's nothing I get as much questions about as, what do I do with these kids who are 4 or 5 years behind or 3 years behind and can't read? Okay, Meredith, should we go on to the questions?
Yep.
All right, we're ready for questions. So we have a lot, and we'll get through as many as we can tonight. So the first one is, it says, I teach students with dyslexia or challenged literacy. The new paradigm is to place them in grade level text. How can this teach reading and keep them from feeling less competent? Only so much time in the day.
Okay, well, the first thing to understand is, it's not clear what the grade level is here, but it's important to understand there are no complexity requirements for grades 1 and 2. Complexity kicks in grades 2 and 3. There is no, the complexity band does not reach down into K and 1. Although there's an emphasis now for all students to work with grade level complex text, that in no way is the only text they should read. What that means is students should have an opportunity on a regular basis to work with grade level complex text, but it should not be the only text that they read, number one. And number two, when they do read that text, that should be with abundant support. And I think we have some materials on Achieve the Core that you'll be able to find as to how to support students with texts that are far above the grade level that they've worked with. But I have to share the experiences that we found when the standards first came out. And we had teachers around the country who grabbed onto it. We had plenty who thought it was nuts, but we also had people who grabbed onto it right away and started using grade level complex text with their students. But that wasn't all they read. They also read text at their level. And what they reported was that the kids loved it. And when I asked them why, They said, well, first of all, they're used to struggle. That's what struggling readers do. They struggle. Second of all, they know the text is not baby text. They know it's not dumbed down. Third of all, they know this is the same kind of text that the other kids in their class or their school are reading. And that in itself was a boost of confidence. So if it's done in the right portions, and if it's done with abundant support, we've seen it time and time again succeed. But it can't be all the students read. The only way you're going to grow your vocabulary and grow your knowledge is a volume of reading. You have to read a lot to grow background knowledge. You have to read a lot to grow vocabulary. And that means that those texts that you're reading have to be mostly on your own. And if you're reading text mostly on your own, you're reading texts that are probably at your grade level, at your independent level or instructional level. Keeping in mind, however, that sometimes when a child is really interested in something, they can read at a higher level. And also, if you're studying something in your class, if you're studying birds for a couple of weeks, then they can read, and they want to find out more about birds, then they can read text that is above their instructional level about birds. But in no way should all text be grade level text. That's unconstitutional.
And with younger students or students who really can't read, that should be accessed as oral reading. It should be read aloud to them, and that is a way you can keep kids on grade level, is giving kids exposure to read aloud at all ages. But David started out by saying when children do get complex text where the grade level calls for it, they need to be supported by their peers, by the classroom setup, by chunking questions, chunking portions of text a lot. But we mostly want to swing back to foundational reading because, of course, if we do foundational reading well, on time or as soon as we can, then kids can access grade level text for themselves because hopefully they've gotten all that system intact for them. So they can read what they want when they want.
You're up for that question too.
Yeah. So the second question, we're going to move on to the second pre-submitted question. For schools without a formal resource for teaching foundational skills, what order should skills be taught, and how can classroom teachers and specialists best serve children so that they're getting the same skill taught almost the same way and reinforce so that they're growing as readers? So we do talk about this a lot in the book, in chapter 5 on how to teach phonics. If you don't know his blog, Tim Shanahan has a blog. I think it's Shanahan on Reading. That he just discussed this over the past 2 weekends, I think, in a sort of Q&A. There is not one right sequence or order for teaching foundational skills. The idea and the research that has settled science on that is that it be systematic, that there be an order, that it be systematically taught. So between the teachers on a grade level and the reading specialist, agreeing on one scope and sequence and getting your hands on one and just agreeing that that's the one everybody's going to follow is the trick. It's not like one is superior and one is not. They all tend to fall into clusters that are similar just because they try to distinguish letter sounds that sound too much alike. They pull those apart a little bit. The short vowels are usually scattered so that kids can start to read words, CVC words, little small words, and start to build on multisyllabic words. We do believe it is unbelievably challenging to try to make foundational skills program, sequence, materials for kids to practice on, make it fun, make it lively, give all the different students all the different amounts of practice they need, differentiate for the kids that get it with something cool that they can do, doing all of that from scratch yourself. We strongly, and assessing on a regular basis so you know who's getting what and who isn't quite caught on yet. So we strenuously recommend, maybe 25 times in the book, and we're leaning into it now on this call, that if you don't have any materials, you get some. And We do call out 2 because they are OER, they're open education resources, and you have to pay to print them and download, but they are there to examine and look at for free. And that is EL Education, which is available on its website. And the other one is Core Knowledge Language Arts, which is also free on the Core Knowledge Foundation's website. They each have different scopes and sequences. They approach things really differently. Dave's going to talk in a second about one thing with core knowledge that sometimes throws people off. They both follow the research on foundational reading. And so if you have nothing, those are free for the taking, except for reproducing materials for kids. But you can do a lot with a projector and a lot on slates and student individual drywall and dry boards and with dry erase markers, whiteboards, sorry. And there are even ways to make homemade whiteboards or that you can use over and over. So you can do this on the cheap, and those are 2 we recommend as solid because they have so much practice material, and in the EL Education's case, lots of song, music, activity that makes it actually really fun. David, do you want to
There's 2 primary differences between EL and CKLA. EL goes much slower. CKLA scope and sequence is the fastest one out there by far. EL goes slower. There's no research as to what's the right rate you should move at. The other difference is that CKLA introduces sounds without letters. I don't know why they do that. I think it's a mistake and it makes people crazy. I just tell teachers to ignore it and teach the letter and the sound together. It's not a problem. The third option for a scope and sequence is the one we used in our school when we took the school from the lowest reading scores in the city of New York, which should impress all of you because New York City's a big freaking city, to over a period of years get scores so high that we were contacted by David Coleman, who's one of the primary architects of the standards.
For the chancellor.
For working for the chancellor. It's called Recipe for Reading, and it's a single book that one teacher can use.
Spiral bound, very old school. Maybe
$30. It's a complete scope and sequence as the other 2 are, and it's kind of you determine the speed that you go at in that sequence, as opposed to EL, which kind of moves slow, and CKLA, which moves fast. So that's what you can do with finding a scope and sequence. Meredith?
No, I think we've answered that one for the most part.
Great. Can we ask a question that's come in through the live Q&A right now? This question has to do with, I think, foundational skills as well. And this question says, what types of assessment should classroom teachers use to group for differentiated instruction?
The best way to assess foundational skills done right with phonics is through dictation. In other words, you've that week, let's say you've worked with short A and you've taught short A words, and you dictate words, you dictate sat, you dictate mat, you dictate hat, etc. And you also, I'll get to that in a minute. And the students write it. If a student can write a word correctly, spell a word correctly, without seeing it in front of them, then they can absolutely read it. So dictation is the absolute best way. It's helpful, especially in the early years, to use pseudo words. So sometimes in the course of instruction, the kids may have seen sat, mat, cat, hat, etc., so much that they've memorized it. So then you don't know, have they internalized a short A rule or have they memorized the spelling? So you throw in what the scientists call a pseudo word or a makeup word or a non-word. So you use a word like lat. Well, I don't know if that's a makeup word or not, but the kids in first grade, it might as well be. And that way you can assess their spelling, their mastery of it. A proficient 5th grade reader reads a word in about half a second. A proficient adult reader reads a word in about a quarter of a second. So anytime, that's automaticity. And if a child can spell a word correctly that they are not seeing in front of them, they're just hearing it, then they can read that word not only accurately, but automatically. And that's really important because struggling readers come across a word and very often they can decode it. So they're a 5th grade reader and he comes across, he thought seriously. And he thought seriously. And he gets it right. It's accurate. Seriously. but it's way too long. It has to be automatic, and automaticity is the goal of decoding, and dictation is the best way to ensure that your students are moving in that direction. And I might add that the EL program that Meredith talked about and CKLA both include dictation in their assessment weekly.
And the other aspect of this that's really important, I think, is there are external assessments. Good programs have them weekly. The problem with waiting with interim assessments that are outsourced, using iReady or the MAPS or anything like that say a district has as a protocol, is what we see over and over again is that teachers then outsource their own observational and diagnostic powers because they're passively waiting for the results of those assessments, and they are administered too frequently when you're doing reading comprehension and too infrequently if you're talking about foundational skills. You've got to know, the classroom teacher, the reading specialist, the people who are with those children every day have to know what every single kid does and doesn't know and what they know to mastery. Otherwise, you're not going to get enough of those children to become automatic readers, which is the whole goal of the system of phonics and exposing kids to it. It's not so they can become great phonics knowledge people and go off and be, specialize in that. It's so they can free up their brain to actually read with comprehension and pleasure. So that's the eye on the prize. And teachers have to stay in control of diagnosing what their kids know. Sure, have periodic iReady or whatever, so the district and the whole school knows where children are. But it's got, ideally, the teacher and in the best systems, American Reading Company, the children know exactly where they are and what they need to work on next, which is the ultimate power, going right to the child who has to intervene. And that's a K-12 program that works really well with older students who are struggling, which may have just answered about 10 questions. They have a program called the IRLA, which is a diagnostic that is very transparent for children, teachers, parents, everybody, and has had good results. So anyway, that's informal, very regular assessments, teacher observation of kids, using invented spelling to see that children are picking up the patterns you've taught, and then any of the interim assessments that are on the market are fine too, just so you can track at scale. But I really believe we have to reinforce for teachers that they're the ones who have to know. They can't wait for results.
Let me just say something about that, though. If you don't know anything about this, that's very hard to do.
Right.
If you know a lot of phonics, and you've been taught phonics, and you understand the difference between systematic phonics and non-systematic phonics, between analytic phonics and synthetic phonics, between a phoneme and a frictive, then you're in great shape, and you can really start analyzing your kids' work. If you don't know that, it's much harder to do that, which is one of the reasons why we say 497 times in the book, get a good program. Meredith mentioned one, American Reading Company, but get a good program. And then teachers can learn the phonics while they're doing the program. Now, I realize as teachers, you can't go over to your district office tomorrow and say, can you please, and David Liben and Meredith Liben said, buy a good program. I saw one on sale for $3 million. Could you please get us a good program? I realize this is not easy. But in the long run, it's really important that you advocate for a better program, because a lot of us, including myself and Meredith, were not prepared by our background to teach systematic phonics.
And the kids suffered for it until we got it.
Where are we, Meredith?
Or Claire.
Yeah. So let's move to, well, before I move on, I just want to reiterate that a lot of the things that have been mentioned thus far in the discussion, the different curricula that they recommended, the strategies and supports for struggling older readers and accessing complex text, these are all in your resource widget. So if you're interested in accessing these things that are being mentioned, they're all there for you. So I wanted to move to a question that is really a compilation of several questions. There's really a trend in the questions that we received. We received several questions about balanced literacy and the use of level text. One user asked, is level text out? What advice do you have for educators currently using a balanced literacy model of instruction?
All right. The issue depends a great deal on the grades. Okay, to start, Meredith?
Yep.
On the grades. And if you're dealing with foundational skills, well, really at any grade, but especially at K to 2, and if you're doing it right, you need to be teaching systematic phonics. And one of the problems with leveled text is they are texts that are not geared towards phonics. In other words, in a phonics program, let's say again, you've been teaching kids short vowel sounds, and they've learned short A and short E, and they go to a traditional leveled reader. Well, there may be some words with that in what they're reading that day, but there may not be that many, and there'll be a whole bunch of other words that are not phonics patterns that they've learned. So the problem is that we teach kids a method of learning how to decode words, and we put them in a book where they can't really use that. So they stop using it because they see it's not helping them. So in a balanced literacy, if you do systematic phonics, which is often not present in balanced literacy, in fact, rarely present, but if you do systematic phonics, and that's step one that you should have, then you have to have a book where kids can get a chance to work with the words with the phonics patterns that they've taught. Now, that could be done with decodables, or it could be done with trade literature that is picked for having a large number of words containing the phonics patterns that kids have been taught, as well as words that they've taught as wholes. Of the 5 high-quality programs that we talk about in our book, they do it in different ways. But they all do it in one way or another. They don't go from systematic phonics to a traditional leveled reader. So that's number one. That doesn't mean that the decodables or the other books have to be all that they read. For independent reading, kids should read whatever they want. But they have to have the opportunity, and they could also read other books for their content area. In EL education, for example, and in all these programs that we talk about, they're topic-oriented. They have a module on a topic. The topic could be birds, it could be habitats, it could be explorers, it could be sports, etc. And they have books that they read that are not leveled texts, that are trade literature, and they have books that they read that are connected to their systematic phonics. The point is you have to give the kids a chance to have a book that contains the kinds of words that they've been studying. And in traditional balanced literacy, we don't have that. So in terms of foundational skills, that's the most important part. A lot of schools in the country use Foundations as a standalone phonics program. I have found that very few of them use it with integrity. Foundations, which is published by Wilson, calls for a 30-minute Tier 1 class, followed by a 30-minute Tier 2 intervention for those kids who struggled with Tier 1. It's a whole class approach. So if everybody was doing short vowel sounds, then 30 minutes, everybody doing short A and short E, and then those kids who struggled get an additional 30 minutes. Problem with Foundations is there's no readers. So what schools do...
books for practicing reading.
Right. In addition, what schools do, in addition to they don't use the 60 minutes, every school I've been in, it's usually been 15 to 20 at the most. What schools do is the kids go right to leveled readers. So they don't get a chance to practice the phonics patterns that they've learned in Foundations. This is similar to Words Their Way, which I saw a question about. Words Their Way is an excellent program. It's an analytic phonics program, as opposed to a synthetic phonics program, which is it works basically on larger word patterns. So you learn the at pattern, and then if I know at, I can spell bat and mat and hat, and if I know fight, I can spell sight and might and right, so forth. But they don't read anything that has anything to do with what they learn in Words Their Way. And that's why when you look at the research on Words Their Way, it's not very good research. It needs some reader that the kids go to that they work on with the books that they've learned. And you could get some of these readers from online for free from EL, online for free from CKLA. You can also go to something called textproject.org, run by a woman named Freddie Hiebert, Hiebert, and she has some wonderful books that are not leveled readers, not decodables, but you'll see that they have an opportunity to practice a wide variety of very high-frequency words that kids are going to come across a lot. So you've got to match up your lessons with your reading. And in balanced literacy, that has not happened. And that's why we have a major reason why we have such poor results in this country. Claire, Meredith?
So that leads me to a question that we had really a trend around this next topic, which is we started talking a minute ago about different timings and the timings of the different components of literacy instruction. And a lot of teachers who use balanced literacy are used to very regimented time blocks, and they're used to that structure. And we had a live question to that effect. And we also saw a lot of questions come in, the pre-submitted questions, about how to structure a literacy block. Specifically, do you guys have an ideal vision for how long a literacy block should be? Should it be 90 minutes? Should it be 120 minutes? How long would you recommend? And then also thinking about the components of that literacy block, things like center work or small group work. Do you have any recommendations or preferences around that?
So I think without getting bogged down for the rest of the hour, because it's a complex question, there's no set research on how long a literacy block is ideal.
Other than the 60 minutes in the CKLA study from New York City.
Right, New York, yeah, exactly. CKLA did a head-to-head study with the original Teachers College units of study, and they had 60 minutes of foundational skills and 60 minutes of ELA a day, 120-minute block. And even in the first year of implementation, the schools outperformed all the control schools, which were
Teachers College reading and writing programs.
So balanced literacy programs. We wrote a paper that's on Achieve the Core called Both and Literacy Instruction, where we argue for a different definition of balance. And that is pretty practical and helpful. The back of it has some recommended uses of the balanced literacy time slots to make sure you get foundational skills in and complex text in for every student in a supportive way. So that's actually probably the best shorthand, is to send people there to look at that, to start discussions in your setting. This is such a charged issue. We've been dealing with this for 30 years. This has been fairly entrenched. But yet when you ask 10 educators, put them in a circle and ask, they have 10 different definitions of balanced literacy, but with similar components. So there's like structures to it that people value that can be co-opted for doing research-based practices and getting, foundational skills, lots of reading at volume for vocabulary and knowledge building so that kids really learn a lot about the world and all become competent readers, and exposure to grade level complex text so they can build academic language, vocabulary, and syntax. Claire, is it okay if we, because we're sort of rolling toward it, also address some of the English language learner questions that have come in?
Yeah, that'd be great. We got a lot of questions about that.
Yeah, so there's some that are really specific, and we probably can't answer now, partly because we're not equipped to do it. We don't know enough, but we do know the research on English language learners and foundational skills. And it's nice because it matches with common sense. If children are coming in fluent in another language, say just spoken fluency, say they're not literate in another language, their home language is another language. It's what they're used to hearing. The sounds and symbols of English are opaque. They're not obvious because spelling patterns in English are based on morphology. They're based on meaning, not on sound, the way, say, Spanish is so beautifully. It is a highly transparent language with lots of mapping, sound to symbol, the sounds map to symbols, so kids learn at the syllable level, and it's much more transparent and straightforward. With English, because we map spelling and word patterns to meaning, it's more opaque and less obvious. So foundational skills systematizes and breaks down and exposes children to the way letters sound when they're patterned in English. So it should be just as for native speakers of English, they're getting to see that this is a written representation. This is how the code is written that we all hear. We all know when we hear it. For kids that are learning the code orally from another language base or language bases, and then have to do the written code, it obviously makes sense if they have as much concrete knowledge about that as possible. So that maps with the research on foundational skills. There were lots of other questions about reading comprehension for English language learners, and that's kind of outside the scope of our hour here. The best practices around English language learners in terms of linguistic partnerships and all kinds of, focus on syntax, et cetera. But another topic for another webinar. David, do you have anything to add to that? Keep going. You
mentioned the research showing that they actually benefit more than L1 students. No, I don't have anything else.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's great. That's super helpful.
What do you want to do next, Claire?
A pre-populated
So I want to ask you a question about fluency, but before I do that, I want to remind everyone that you can be asking questions yourselves right now. We're barreling towards the end of our discussion. Time is just flying by. So if you do want to ask a question of David or Meredith, please go ahead and use that purple Q&A button to submit your questions, and we will continue to try and get to as many of them as we can. So now I want to ask a little bit about fluency. We had a number of questions from teachers who are working to build their students' fluency. This one in particular is about some of the components of fluency. And the question is, what is your advice when working with a student who reads very accurately and comprehends well, but who is not reading fluently? The student has accuracy and correct expression, but is not reading at rates the rates expected with oral reading benchmarks.
Unfortunately, I don't think I would invite that teacher to email me. It's fine with me, but I don't have the information to answer that. I would have to know what the grade level of the child is. I would have to know what measures are being used to determine that student is reading
accurately.
Is reading accurately, but not reading fluently. In other words, the way most of the time we determine the right rate is a series of national norms made by people called Hasbrook and Tyndall, and they give you like an average number of words correct per minute in the fall, spring, and in the fall, winter, and spring. Like for the third grade, I think that the spring number is about 120 words correct per minute, and I usually take away 10% of that and say, like, if you're reading about 108 words correct per minute in the spring, you're okay in third grade. So I would need...
Can I just interrupt with an anecdote from the book? I reached out to Jan Hasbrook when we were writing the book because they've actually just updated those norms. And she confirmed what we had heard anecdotally from other people, but she was super approachable. She said, the midline is what we're going for. Those norm ranges are extremes. We are not looking for kids to go racing toward the upper end of the range. The midline is what we're looking for. And I think reading fluency and rate are really horribly misunderstood, and people think kids have to keep reading faster and faster and faster. And we try to be humorous about that in the book, but it's really a tragic thing. So you want the midline of those norms if you're used to the Hasbrook and Tyndall norms.
So for this student, I would need to know, they read accurately, they comprehend. I would want to know how that comprehension is met. It's very unusual for a student to not read with any fluency but comprehend well.
And be accurate with word pronunciation.
Right. So I would need to know how you're measuring that comprehension.
Oh, they're just not. They're not reading at the rates expected with oral reading benchmarks. You know who else doesn't read at the rates expected with oral reading benchmarks? David Liben, and he remembers everything he reads. I read at the top end of the norms, and I forget half of what I read. So that child may not have a problem.
That's connected to what Meredith said just now and earlier. I'm wondering how far below the WCPM is this child? So I would need to know how far below the WCPM is, and I would need to know how assessment is being determined. Not accuracy. That's pretty straightforward. It's pretty unusual for a kid to have no comprehension problems but not read fluently at all. It happens, but it's pretty unusual, and you want to get all the details before you try to answer that question.
Yeah.
Great.
Next, Claire.
So this is a big question. So we'll see how. I feel like this have a whole webinar on this question. but we'll see how much we can get through of it. So this one is about interventions for students who are significantly below grade level. And the question is, what are the key components of ELA curriculums or key reading skills that would be most effective to focus on if students are two or more years below grade level? And they're asking about, they want to know for primary school, for intermediate elementary, middle school, and high school. Are there different focus areas when you're trying to catch students up?
All right, for intermediate elementary and middle school and high school, the answer is chapter 7. You have to do everything. It would be great if we could find one thing. So the kid is 3 years behind grade level, and I focus on fluency, I'm done. The kid is 5 years behind grade level, I focus on vocabulary, I'm done. It doesn't work that way. Reading weaves everything together in a tapestry that is very difficult to untangle, very difficult to untangle. If you can't decode, then you usually can't read fluently. If you can't read fluently, you can't grow your comprehension. If you don't grow your comprehension, then you're not growing your vocabulary. If you don't grow your comprehension and your vocabulary, then you're not growing your knowledge. So children who are significantly far behind need everything. They don't get everything. That's what makes it so difficult. And that's why the thrust of chapter 7 was, how can we integrate everything that these students need? In K-2, you have a little more leeway. In K-2, if you read aloud to students, you can continue to develop their vocabulary no matter how far behind they are in reading. Now, many times in this country that doesn't happen, and many of the programs, except these new ones that we talk about in the book, do not have a significant amount of reading aloud in K-2. The programs that we call for and argue for in the book have 40 to 60 minutes a day of read aloud in K-2. So the children's vocabulary and background knowledge will continue to grow regardless of their foundational skills or their decoding ability. So in K-2, if you do a significant amount of reading aloud, and there I can tell you what you should focus on: decoding with accuracy and automaticity. Definitely put the weight of your foot on those two areas: read aloud and decoding with accuracy and automaticity. Now, while you're digesting all of that, which is a mouthful, I'll add one more thing. There's a recent body of research called orthographic mapping that I'm doing a lot of work with lately. And what it seems to be saying is that students who are that far behind need a lot of phonological awareness work, not just blending sounds together like it means sit, or pulling sounds apart, like what's the first sound in bat, what's the last sound in movie. But they need to blend, they need to segment, they need to delete, take the first sound off of late, and what do you have? You have 8. They need extensive work in phonological awareness, because in all likelihood, those students who are that far behind probably have some kind of phonological processing difficulties. So how do you do that? Fortunately, we have a great answer for that. There's a book called Phonemic Awareness in Young Children, written by Marilyn Adams, an experimental psychologist who is one of the co-authors of the Foundational Skills Standards. Should be on the bottom, Meredith. And that gives you a complete phonemic phonological awareness curriculum. It's all games, it's all activities, it's all fun, including the lesson, the games, and the assessment. And at the K-2 level, I seriously suggest that your teachers get that book and work with those students with that. Sometimes teachers find it difficult. We're saying, my child's in the 2nd grade, he needs to be decoding, not just blending and segmenting. Well, you're doing it with words and games. And you can also see a great example of this in chapter 7 also, in the games that we put into that chapter. So I would recommend for K-2, put the weight of your foot by far on phonemic awareness in young children, on reading aloud so that they continue to grow their vocabulary even though they can't decode or read with fluency, and on the kind of games and activities that you will see really not just in chapter 7, but in the chapters on how to teach systematic phonics. Meredith, you want to add to that?
No.
Couldn't find Marilyn's book?
No, I had it. Why do you need it? No, I was looking for a word.
I thought you were going to hold it up, but it doesn't work yet.
It doesn't work.
Not a visual medium tonight.
No.
That's great. So I have a really short question for you. which is, would you support the idea if a school decides to focus only on literacy and numeracy for grades K through 2?
Well, what they would get, I don't know what they would get with numeracy, but what they would get with literacy is, if they did it right, if they had a systematic phonics program that followed a scope and sequence, and students read books that incorporated words that had the phonetic elements that were taught, they would get kids who could decode with accuracy. If they assessed correctly, they would get kids who could decode with accuracy and decode with automaticity, if they assessed through dictation. If they followed up with a fluency program, similar to the one we talked about in the book or any of Tim Brzezinski's work, they would get kids who could read fluently. But the kids would not know a lot about the world. Their vocabulary would not be what it should be, and their knowledge would not be what it should be. So on the other hand, if they reached the 3rd grade and they could read with fluency, they have a shot at acquiring that vocabulary
for themselves.
For themselves. It's a risky bet. And generally speaking, most of us who go into education did not go there because we failed to make it as professional poker players. So it's a real risk. It would be a fascinating experiment. If I had more time, I could tell you about a research study that actually did something like that. But I don't think I have time to talk about David's study, Meredith. Do you?
No. Well, you can do it. Can you do it quickly?
I talk quick, but I cover a lot. Well, this was a study done by a professor who we work with, who's done some brilliant work, who went into the lowest performing 10 schools in the lowest performing district in a large southeastern state. This district was performing so well that the state took it over. Now, the states don't like to take over districts because usually they don't do any better. So they really resisted as long as they can. But the state took over this district. He went into the 10 lowest performing schools in the district and taught teachers to teach systematic phonics. And what he found was that after 3 years, those students who were able to pass a phonics assessment had a 70% of those students passed the state ELA test. And at that time, the state ELA test was very well aligned with the standards. And what that shows you, and now these kids could not have had a great vocabulary. They were 100% free and reduced price lunch. They were in a school district that had the lowest scores in the history of the galaxy. So the vocabulary couldn't have been that great. Their background knowledge couldn't have been that great. But they had their foundational skills. And what that tells you, they could read the words on the page accurately. And they could decode with automaticity. And they could read with fluency. So what that tells you is if you give kids these tools, they can on their own start to figure out some of the words they don't know the meaning of. And they can on their own kind of figure out what the references might be to an event or a place or a person or an idea that is not part of their background knowledge. They can weave an understanding of those constructs because they can read the words on the page well and with accuracy and fluency. So in this case, that would kind of say that, well, maybe if you just really focused on decoding and fluency and you really got that right, your kids might end up better by the 3rd grade. Now, knowledge demands and vocabulary demands on an increase every year. But those kids who go into the 3rd grade, reading at 3rd grade level, pass the test, will continue to grow their vocabulary and continue to grow their knowledge if they continue to read. But so you could do it, but it's a gamble.
Super, yeah. And Read Aloud gives all that. It also is a daily demonstration when it's done well by teachers who themselves enjoy reading. It's a daily demonstration of what the children are heading toward as they learn to read for themselves. It just generates the desire. And in my ideal world, the books that are read aloud to children that they most love when they're in K and 1 are the kids get to read them for themselves when they're in 2nd and 3rd grade. The Charlotte's Webbs of the world, or later on Harry Potter. If it's read aloud to 2nd graders, they can read it for themselves in 4th or 5th. Then you have a reader for life, let alone kids who have passion for learning about the world, some specific corner of the world, and get that information read to them and then get to access it for themselves as readers. So, and the kids that need school to do to do much more for them in terms of building academic knowledge or topical knowledge like we're talking about. We can't just leave it to the ether that they're going to become, highly motivated or driven readers. We need to take care of that in school. So it's not a bet I would want anybody to take. Plus, it's not as much fun. Do we have time for one more, Claire?
Well, I think we have one question here that just is asking David to repeat the name of that study and its lead researcher.
So Paige was the lead researcher. Perfetti was in there. It's a whole bunch of other people.
No.
David Page's study?
David Page's study is on our website, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's posted on our website.
It's called Path Analytic.
Yeah, David Page with an I. I will chat it out. And it's something about the path analytic model.
I think it's on our website somewhere, Claire.
I'll do send all.
Yeah, well, yeah, and we can, what we'll do is we'll find the exact link to it and we'll put it in the resource widget, which leads me nicely to another question that we have from a couple of people, which is where you can access the resources after the webinar. So everyone who has joined the webinar tonight will have access to all of the resources that are in that green resource widget, and I will add the study that was just discussed to it, so that will be in there as well. And so you will receive an email after the webinar is complete. It'll have a link to it, and you can go in and access just like you have now and access all of the resources that are in that resource widget. And I think that is all the time we have. Oh, go ahead.
I think someone might have asked about orthographic mapping.
I wrote it in. I answered.
Sorry.
No, that's great. You guys have been great at answering questions. Meredith has been tag teaming, doing some written responses here. It's really been wonderful to have you guys on as guests tonight. So many great tips, pearls of wisdom, insights, anecdotes. It's been really helpful, I think, to have you guys share it with us all tonight. And so just a quick reminder, I had a slide here about how to use the Q&A widget. You guys were great. You didn't need my help with that. But to join our Core Advocate Network, if you aren't already a member, the link to join the Core Advocate Network is in the resource widget as well. And the slides, you'll have access to the slides in the resource widget. These are just links to more ways that you can stay in touch with us. And I just wanted to invite everyone for our next webinar, which is, this is actually a special Q&A discussion. So our next webinar is just 2 weeks away, and that is on formative assessment strategy, thinking beyond the paper pencil test. And the link to register for that webinar is here on the slide, and it's also in your resource widget. So thank you to everyone who joined tonight. Thank you to Meredith and David. It's really been a pleasure to hear and have all this great literacy discussion. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Have a good night.